Okay, so we are here to discuss decision-making within the RtI framework, and we'll focus a bit on RtI for specific learning disability identification across reading, writing, and mathematics. So following this session, our session outcomes are to describe RtI for students with academic, language, and behavioral concerns. We'll discuss considerations for the use of RtI in evaluating specific learning disabilities, and we'll also discuss how teams might differentiate between SLD and English language acquisition. A few introductions. My name is Lydia Amy. I am a Patent West consultant. We have, starting from over at the long end, Dr. Tim Runge. He is a professor in Department of Psychology at Indiana University of Pennsylvania and a school psychologist. Dr. Drew Hunter is a professor in the Department of Psychology at Millersville University and a school psychologist. Dr. Erica Karuder is an educational consultant with Patton Central. She is a school psychologist and also the state lead for the School Psychology Initiative. And Dr. Tammy Thompson-Cook is an educational consultant with Patton as well out of the East Office. And she is a speech-language pathologist and the office lead for speech and language and the state lead for assistive technology. Okay. So we'll begin today's panel by discussing the broad considerations for how school staff and MTSS teams can use data to drive individual student and school-wide decisions. To start, Dr. Runge, we have heard a number of terms over the years: RtI, RtII, MTSS, RtI academic. Sometimes these terms have been used interchangeably. How might we conceptualize these terms?
That's a really good question, and thank you all for being here. There are plenty of seats a little bit closer. We all will not bite, scratch, claw, or anything like that if you want to move a little bit closer, but I also appreciate that everybody is far more comfortable sitting far away from us. But to the question, which is a really good question, and frankly, I am probably as guilty as anyone else in terms of using these terms interchangeably, and that largely is a product of some of the literature that has been around for about 20 or so, actually more than 20 years, probably 30 years by now. And so what I'm trying to do, even in my own practice as an instructor of future school psychologists, as well as teachers, and in the work that I do in writing and so forth, is really clearly defining what are these terms. MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support, is the framework or the structure by which we can allocate resources in an effective and efficient manner to meet the needs of all learners. There are core features associated with MTSS, including assessment practices that go from Tier 1 all the way through Tier 3. And of course, in Pennsylvania, we use a 3-tiered model. Some states have a 4. It doesn't matter the number of tiers, just as long as you appreciate that there are increasing amounts of assessment practices, intensity of services and supports for students as you go up the pyramid, and that you have lots of other features like high-quality, effective Tier 1 or core instructional practices. So it really is the framework by which all of this work is done so that schools can efficiently and effectively meet the needs of all students. Contrast that with RtI, which typically is used interchangeably as the question indicates, and as I have been known to do from time to time erroneously. RtI is really the process of looking at a student or a group of students' responsiveness to intervention. Think of what RtI stands for, responsiveness to intervention. So it is how they are growing or developing either academically or behaviorally, which is why you see terms like RtI academics, RtI for behavior. It's the process of looking at data while an individual or a group of individuals is receiving something special, whether it's Tier 2 supports, Tier 3, or you could even look at universally Tier 1. How are they growing or how are they developing across time? You can't do RtI unless you have MTSS. RtI is embedded within the MTSS framework. So in my view, you really have to build MTSS first before you can then approach using RtI practices, responsiveness to intervention practices, well. And again, a lot of the interchangeable language is caused by confusion or differing uses of those terms over the last 20 or 30 years by yours truly as well as virtually everybody else. And we are trying to do a better job of clearly defining that you have MTSS as a system or a framework, and then RtI is a process for looking at data as students grow within an MTSS model.
Thank you, Dr. Runge. I'm definitely one of those people who has also used those words interchangeably. So digging in a little deeper, let's talk about an essential component of effective MTSS, universal screening. Dr. Hunter, what have we learned about universal screening to help us screen smarter, not harder?
I would say, in terms of like what's happened lately with universal screening, I've honestly seen very little evidence of better screening practices than curriculum-based measurement, at least at the early elementary level. In terms of how efficient they are, the psychometric properties of them, and the type of problem solving, they're easy to aggregate and do problem solving at the group level, right? You can even look at rate and accuracy and derive a little bit of diagnostic information in terms of maybe what type of intervention the student needs from those as well. And it's a couple minutes a kid, and they've been around forever. They're tried and true, and they're pretty simple. So I think, K to 3, adding anything to that, really, I don't know that it's going to help with your decision-making process. I think it's just taking, right, because anytime we're assessing a student or screening them, that's time away from instruction, right? So do I need to add some sort of screening on top of that? If I can get this information in 3 to 5 minutes and it's reliable and valid, like, that's good enough, or at least I think that's good enough. I would also say, too, that there's, in my time in the field, too, by the time we left, kids were getting, like, district anyway, kids were getting, like, we'll say screened with like 3 different measures 3 times a year, right? Only one of those was actually a screening. The other 2 were diagnostic measures. So I really think it's important for schools to differentiate between what is a screening measure that we're using as part of a multi-tiered system of support and potentially our response to intervention versus what is a diagnostic measure, and do we need a diagnostic measure on every student in our school? I would say no. I'm not sure that that's a good use of time and or resources. And then I think by the time you get past 3rd grade, when you're starting to get into that upper elementary, like where the line gets kind of blurry between are we in elementary or secondary anymore, you have enough pre-existing data on students that universal screening can be as simple as looking at your high-stakes assessment from the year before, looking at who on that is not proficient, and then devoting your assessment resources to just those students, and not assessing students that we know are fine and that have historically been fine since they've entered our district, right? So like, I guess it all boils down to me, at what point are we doing too much assessment, right? And that may sound crazy because I'm a school psychologist and I love assessment, right? But like, what is the purpose of our assessment? Multiple measures don't improve your screening accuracy. That's been documented through research, right? And I've not seen, I would say, the efficiency or the results in trying to use a diagnostic measuring tool, like a standards-based diagnostic tool as a screening measure. I think you're going to get way too many false positives there, and I don't know that any school has the resources to really address that. So in my mind, let's just stick with what's simple, what works, and what's easy to implement. And to me, like I said, that's CBM up and through your early elementary grades, and then that's just kind of using some kind of existing data source from the previous year when you get into upper elementary, secondary to identify those students.
Can I add a piece? I'm already going off script.
All right, go for it.
Sorry. So just to operationalize, I think, so CBM, like oral reading fluency, ORF, it's been around for like 50 years. It's good. Use it. Earlier, Mark Shin commented on, you get all these composite scores and these cluster scores that are frankly unnecessary. It's just more assessment. Math screening is a little bit different. It's going to, vary across the grades. And I'm going to put a little plug. Written expression CBM, which nobody does, and the reason they don't do it is because it takes too much time. I'm doing a small project right now, and we've evaluated how long it actually takes to score written expression CBM, and it's the same amount of time as it takes you to give an oral reading fluency measure. So I don't think there isn't this concern, there shouldn't be this concern about quote unquote wasting resources, because administering WECBM is really easy. It's group administered. Scoring it is somewhat of a barrier. You just train a few people, but it can be done very quickly. You can train them and they can efficiently and effectively score those in 3 to 5 minutes, which is no different than getting an oral reading fluency measure. And if schools are happy giving oral reading fluency measures, then I don't see why we can't also give WECBM. Sorry to give a little plug there and go off script.
Sorry. Thank you.
Perfect. Feel
I
free
agree
to
with
do that at
everything
any time.
Tim just said.
So we talked about universal screening. Let's dig in a little deeper and consider class-wide intervention. Many people do not think of class-wide intervention as a piece of universal screening, the process and response to intervention. Can any of you discuss how class-wide intervention fits into an MTSS framework and also how it enhances decision-making in response to intervention?
Push it up. Push it up.
I can't figure that out. Thank you, Tim. I think class-wide intervention and universal screening definitely go hand in hand. I know you should be talking about this. You have the book on it. Class-wide intervention is sometimes conceptualized as like tier 1.5, right? It's not intervention. It's delivered at the classroom level. All students in the class get it. But what class-wide intervention really does is when we think about screening, right, we are getting into this idea of false positives and false negatives, okay? Like my screening has identified a student as being at risk and they're not really at risk. Or my screening says that this student is fine and they're not really fine, right? It's some sort of error in your screening. And that's just part of, error is part of every system, right? And we can't really eliminate it. And as I alluded to earlier, many people try to eliminate this by incorporating more measures, and that does not help. But class-wide intervention actually really helps, because really the only way to determine who really is a false positive and who really is a false negative is to give them a trial dose, right, of intervention and see how they respond. And so it really helps improve the accuracy of our screening results with what I would say are less resources than, again, adding in additional measures, right? Because the thing with class-wide intervention, too, is I don't know if anyone's familiar with structured peer tutoring or peer-assisted learning strategies, right? They've been around for a while. Wonderfully evidence-based practices that actually help every student, right? And have huge effect sizes, like some of the biggest effect sizes we get in educational intervention. So not only can I more accurately identify who's in need of intervention, which means I'm not wasting limited resources on students who don't need that support. It also gives us another look at students who may have been those false negatives, right? And so that way that student's not hanging out without support until the middle of the year, right? And missing that valuable time. They're also just highly effective instructional practices that are going to benefit every student in the room. Takes about 15 minutes, and it's completely peer mediated, right? So that you just have to train the students how to do it, find the time for them to do it, and then just kind of monitor and make sure they're on task. So I just, to me, there's really, like, class-wide intervention, there's really no reason not to be doing it if you can. It's just it's a good use of resources, and it benefits all the students, and it's going to benefit your system. So there are definitely people here of more expertise in class-wide intervention than myself if they wanted to add anything to that.
I'd be happy to add something. Just, again, I'm a related services provider, or I come from that framework, so I'm looking at things from the lens of every student that I work with. I'm intensifying based on their unique needs in the classroom. I think I'm on. So when I look at classroom measurements, whether it's diagnostic, formative, or summative, I'm always wondering, what are we doing with that data? I've attended the MTSS trainings that are fabulous. We have, great speakers like Tim and Drew that, are part of this process that help us reframe our thinking about what is the information that we're taking in, how are we intensifying instruction. If you attended Dr. Shin's session this morning, he was asking, how are we measuring growth? That's something that I'm always wondering. How do we change our practices within the classroom so that we're allowing our students to benefit. And then if you attended Dr. Eddie Burns' session, he's suggesting that we intensify things in a way that our students continue on a J curve instead of a bell curve. So I think the challenge is, again, what is the data telling us, and how are we changing our practices to reflect that?
Yeah, and as, I don't think I'm on.
I think you're on here too.
How about that? There we go. So I'm a school psychologist by training, but do a lot of work on our math initiative. And so kind of a bulk of my time is spent supporting class-wide intervention, specifically in math. And it really does have tremendous benefits. One of the things it does is it helps reduce that base rate for risk in your general population. So we support a lot of different schools. And one of the first things we do when we do some systems level consultation is look at those systems data. And if there's a high base rate for risk, that lets us know, you know what, that this is probably a site where class-wide intervention for math is going to be really beneficial. And as Drew said, it helps us determine who are the kids who truly need more intensive intervention, more resource-intensive intervention, and who are the students that getting that dose of class-wide is going to help them develop those essential skills that they need for proficiency in math. So it really is effective, efficient, and equitable. All students are getting access to that. If the median student in a class is scoring below that risk criterion, that's a good indicator that the entire class can benefit from class-wide intervention. Should take just 15 minutes per day. There are some publicly available for math, commercially available for math, some reading ones as well. And we also we've been supporting some sites, we'll talk about reading in a little bit, with class-wide intervention for reading, partner reading with paragraph shrinking, and seeing schools get some really good results. Some of our schools participating in systemic supports that also have a high base rate for risk. So it really is good as additional layers to your screening, plus getting intervention delivered in a really effective way.
Thank you for that. So we touched a little bit upon, I think Dr. Hunter might have mentioned the difference in, or Dr. Runge maybe, the difference in universal screening in elementary versus secondary settings. Dr. Karuder, can you say a little bit more about universal screening procedures and class-wide intervention and how they might look different in elementary versus secondary settings?
Yes, that's all right. So how many of you, so I was going to say, Drew, and I like to be called Eric. It's all good.
Eric, okay.
So how many of you went to Dr. Shin's sessions earlier, secondary MTSS implementers? It can be a little bit different, right? There's not like a Dibbles or a Cadence for 11th graders. We have a lot of existing data already. In Pennsylvania, we've kind of adopted a model. There are some other data sources that we can look at. We have years of existing data, right? High stakes testing. Looking in Pennsylvania in particular, we have the PBIS reports, and you can pull what's called the quintile diagnostic summary, and you can look at that distribution of achievement over time. Achievement is pretty stable, so it's going to be, unless something really powerful is happening, we're not going to see tremendous, shifts in student performance across quintiles. We're not going to see a student performing in the bottom 20% one year and in the top, 80 to 99th percentile the next year. It stays pretty stable. So that is one source of data that you already have, existing data. You know who those students are, so rescreening isn't really necessary or that helpful. Looking at those PBIS data, again, looking at the distribution of achievement across a system can help you think about how do we need to allocate resources. For example, do we have 60 or 70% of our student population distributed in the lowest performing quintiles? Then we might need to think about adding, for example, an additional class to our block to provide treatment for those missing skills that students need to develop. Another area, some of you may have participated in other series or sessions that you've heard about early warning system. How many have heard about early warning system? A couple, okay. So looking at data like your attendance, behavior, and course performance. Out of Johns Hopkins, they've done some research and looked at what are some criteria that lets us know that a student is maybe on track to not graduate. They are at high risk for dropping out of school. And those red flags are missing more than 10% of school, having one behavior like reportable offense, and failing a core course such as ELA or math. And you can find those on our patent website if you look at like early warning system, ABCs, and the Everyone Graduates Center at Johns Hopkins. You can see those algorithms. But that is another thing that's really critical in our secondary schools. If we're not intervening with those students who are at risk for dropping out, then that likelihood that they're going to drop out is significantly higher. The first marking period of that 9th grade year is a really critical time to look at for our high school students with regard to early warning system data. So those are some additional things that you can look at for secondary schools that's a little bit different than giving the Acadian screener for phonemic awareness. We're not doing those things at the secondary level. Looking at your existing data, looking at early warning system data is really critical at the secondary level.
Thank you, Erica.
Yeah.
So let's see here. Sorry about that.
All right.
Okay, so we'll move on a little bit to focusing on SLD in reading, writing, and math. So we're going to focus on a series of questions that involves using data to evaluate specific learning disabilities across those areas, and we're also going to discuss considerations for English language learners. So getting right down to it, let's talk about the why and the how. Dr. Runge, why should we use RtI for specific learning disability eligibility determination, and how do we do it?
Okay. IDEA permits 3 different approaches to the identification of SLD: IQ achievement discrepancy, cognitive pattern of strengths and weaknesses, which is typically operationalized as cognitive pattern of strengths and weaknesses, and responsiveness to intervention. That's IDEA. In Pennsylvania regulations, there are only 2 options. There's IQ achievement discrepancy and RtI. If you are in a system that is using cognitive pattern of strengths and weaknesses as your eligibility decision-making process in Pennsylvania, I would caution against that immediately, since that is actually not permissible within Pennsylvania regulations, and we have Joe Kovaleski and others to thank for that. So why would you use RtI? I'm going to paraphrase one of my favorite authors and presenters, that's Matt Burns. He describes RtI, and I believe this as well, as being the best option of a lot of options that aren't great. Yes, I just said RtI is not perfect. No approach is perfect. Now, we all hopefully can agree that IQ achievement discrepancy analyses are absolutely antiquated and frankly discriminatory against many, many students, so we should abandon those immediately. RtI, when implemented well, and some of you maybe were in Dr. Ryan Farmer's session earlier today when he and I got into a little bit of conversation about RtI. When implemented well, it is the best option of a bunch of options that are imperfect. No system is going to be perfect, and a lot of that has to do with various factors, inclusive of there's always going to be error in any decision that we make, right? And also, some of the operationalizations of the procedures within an RtI framework for SLD determination are still relatively unclear, and I think Drew's probably going to comment on some of that in a bit. I'm setting him up, to use a volleyball analogy. How about that? But how to do it would essentially be, and I have literally 2 minutes to talk about it. You got to first have MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support in place. You need high-quality universal screeners that are short in duration and highly technically adequate. You need tiered supports. You need a variety or a menu of supports that that can be aligned directly to students' needs, obviously at Tier 2 and then at Tier 3. But importantly, when it comes down to the actual decision-making process of RTI, while it is more complicated than this, there are two key features. So again, it's more than just that, but two key features are, what is their performance level, and what is their responsiveness to intervention? Performance level is, how are they doing right now at the point of the evaluation? Responsiveness to intervention is, how well have they grown during high-quality interventions that we have fidelity data to document that they actually received the intervention as prescribed? So level and responsiveness to intervention. The operationalization of those two features is where things get a little murky. Level is relatively easy, and we tend to use more of like a percentile rank threshold. Typically 10th percentile rank or lower is indicative of low performance. But the problem is what about the kid who performs at the 11th percentile? We have to draw arbitrary lines in the sand, and that means some kids get in and some kids don't, and that is not perfect. It's ugly, it's messy. But that's the easier of the two. The second one is responsiveness to intervention, in other words, growth over time, and the measurement of that is very nuanced and is not as simple as this kid is growing well and this kid is not. So I think that RTI is the best way to identify SLD, but I also fully appreciate the challenges that it brings, but I would rather take on those challenges than doing something really well like pattern of strengths and weaknesses, even though the evidence says it's bad for kids. I'd rather do something that we're still working out the bugs, but we know it's good for kids, than doing something that we know is bad for kids.
All right, so cut me off, since we're on a time budget here, because I could talk endlessly about this. Just elaborate a little bit on what Tim said too, and that's this idea that no matter what model of identification you're using, you're going to have issues with reliability, right? And that has to do with this idea that we're taking something that exists on a continuum and we're trying to make it dichotomous, and it's not. So wherever you decide to put your cut point for who is disabled versus who is not, you're going to have error. So you can move that cut point around wherever you want, and you're still going to have unreliable classification because of that, right? That being said, RTI is the only of the three that has validity in terms that it actually identifies a group of students consistently who are more impaired on the important things related to reading than any other approach. So what we lack in reliability, we certainly make up for in validity. So that's comforting to me anyway, right? So we're not going to get it right, and two people may come to different conclusions. That's always been the case with identifying students with disabilities. But at least we know that we're more likely going to get the lowest performing students who are most impaired in our context and get them the most resources. And I think that's powerful, at least. In terms of like why should we do this? If you think about MTSS as resource allocation, right? Using RTI for SLD eligibility is maximizing the resources you're getting from your school psychologist, okay? They can spend their entire life administering tests that have no treatment utility whatsoever. I'm talking about IQ tests, right? No treatment utility. Literally are only useful for classifying intellectual disabilities and intellectual giftedness. In between, there's no point in using them. But we're spending thousands of dollars in materials and labor to do this, and why? That person could be doing so much more in your system in terms of assisting with interventions, assisting with data analysis, providing mental health counseling, doing preventative work, generally being a human being that's not locked in an office all day writing the same report over and over and over again, right? Those are all things that should be of high value to a school system, which I think is like another reason why we should do this as well. What's the second here? How do we do it? There's generally no consensus on this, but generally, and if you look at the federal regulations, it talks about what Tim talked about in this dual discrepancy approach, right? I need to be below in my ability, my performance level, not my like intellectual ability, like my reading skills, and then below in my growth rate in response to instruction. There's a variety of ways to operationalize that. And really what the research tells us is that however you operationalize it, that's going to affect the group of kids you identify, right? We don't have concrete criteria to say growth this slow is a disability. It's just not that easy, and we're never going to get it because measuring growth is really nuanced, right? It's hard to do, and the more measurements you're trying to take in, the error just compounds. So I just don't have enough time to go into all this here, but like I know my colleague and I, Mike Bonashevsky, are doing some work around this too. And we believe that there's a lot of existing data sources that schools have access to that you can incorporate into your decision making. So we don't need to collect additional data or do additional tests, right? But I can calculate a slope for a student's progress monitoring data, and that can be growth. I can also look at where did they start and where did they end, and that can be growth. I can look at a percentile rank that's generated from an SGP or whatever, and that can be growth. So there are multiple ways I can look at growth without collecting additional data, but then I also have to consider other things, right? Like how long has this kid been in intervention? He may have a really impressive slope, but if I've been in tier 3 for 4 years, I'm clearly not closing the gap, right? That's information about growth too, right there. So looking at things that are quantitative, like what's my number and what can I compare that to, but also look at, the quality of the intervention. Is it a good match to the intervention, to the student's need? How long have they been in that intervention? What does research say about the efficacy of that intervention? Is it our most intensive support and service? I think those are all factors we should be looking at outside of just numbers. And I also think that's more consistent with IDEA, which says we shouldn't be making any decision based on the sole criterion, right? So if your criterion for growth is just being above or below a certain number on something, I don't think you're really looking at growth comprehensively and really meeting that criterion. And I'll stop there. How did I do on time?
Okay, thank you. I think that we have been talking overall about why MTSS broadly can lead to improved student outcomes for reading, writing, math, and even behavior. Do any of you have anything additional to add as to why a multi-tiered system of support leads to improved outcomes?
Perhaps I'll just add briefly a little bit more so we can catch up on our time. I'm timing myself. I'm a behaviorist, so I measure everything, even my own behavior. Sorry. With a well-implemented MTSS system, you have a variety or a menu of interventions. And by the way, interventions don't necessarily have to be a packaged curriculum or intervention that you purchase. An intervention could be more opportunities to respond, OTR, which is the behavioral literature from like 50 years ago that we're now applying to academics. So oftentimes these interventions are not anything terribly difficult to install, particularly at tier 1 or tier 2. Obviously tier 3, behavior is a little bit more intractable, so you need something that's a little bit more intense. But I think once you have the MTSS system in place, you have a menu of interventions available and practices that you can funnel students into. I always appreciate Kathleen Lane's statement from a number of years ago, if you screen, you must intervene. Well, I almost forgot it. If you screen, you must intervene. Go through if you screen but you don't have any interventions ready and available for students, then why bother screening? You can admire the problem, but you have no way of trying to address those situations. And therefore, I think, again, having a fully integrated MTSS system for academics and behavior means then you have data, lots of it, that you can then identify student needs and immediately funnel them into services at whatever need they have for reading, writing, mathematics, and behavior. And so therefore, again, back to Drew's comment earlier about validity, just the whole validity of like, hey, we're focused on giving kids interventions as opposed to doing more cognitive assessments or even more standardized norm reference academic achievement measure tests that we don't necessarily need because it doesn't inform instruction. Therefore, I believe just the heavy emphasis on using data to drive instruction and intervention is what makes MTSS so critical.
Thank you. So within a multi-tiered system of support, we measure student outcomes and we also measure implementation fidelity data. Dr. Karuder, can you discuss what tools and resources are available to help school teams evaluate MTSS, including RtI, at a systems level?
Yeah, so I'll share one example with everyone and ask the others to jump in as well. In Pennsylvania, we do have the MTSS RtI for SLD fidelity tool. You can find it on the patent webpage. And it's a really great systems level tool. You don't do that in isolation. You do that with essentially your building leadership MTSS team. And you have a support in Pennsylvania of intermediate unit consultants, patent consultants. It's really helpful to have an external person talk through those things with you. Sometimes schools rate themselves really well, and maybe that's not happening, or sometimes schools rate themselves really harshly, and having someone to have that conversation. But we look at those different components necessary for an MTSS, looking at it from the systems level, and then embedded within that is a response to intervention item where we get more granular with some of those data. But it can be very helpful to, if you're like, how do we get started with this? How do we even know where we are? Systems change can be hard, so having a systems level tool to help guide that conversation can be very helpful. There's a couple others that we're using in Pennsylvania too. If anyone's participated in systemic supports, there is one. You may have seen a session. Dr. Kim St. Martin is here from Michigan. The Reading Tiered Fidelity Inventory. We also have drafted a math version. We are using that this year, the Math Tiered Fidelity Inventory. It's not as beautiful as the Michigan one. Those are a couple tools to kind of help you look at those systems. But I was going to say, I'll tag in my other colleagues if there are other tools that that you like as well, or.
For academics or behavior?
Academics.
So if you're looking at PBIS, MTSS for behavior, there's like 4 or 5 fidelity measures that you could use, but the one that is increasingly gaining prominence is the tiered fidelity inventory, which is the behavioral version of the reading one that Erica just noted. But there are other ones, the benchmarks of quality, team implementation checklists. So those are all research validated. They've been around for a number of years, and that would be a way of assessing the key features of PBIS implementation. By the way, PBIS wasn't listed as one of those acronyms on the first question, but that's another one that we just throw in there. It is, PBIS is MTSS for behavior, just to clarify.
Okay, thank you. So now let's spend some time talking about SLD in reading. There are a number of factors to consider when students experience difficulty in reading and are consequently referred for an evaluation for SLD determination. Dr. Hunter, would you like to speak to those factors?
Sure. I think when we think about SLD and using RtI, we go to the numbers right away, like, all right, where are they performing at, and what's that intervention slope and everything like that. But I honestly think the first question we need to ask, and you shouldn't, if you're in a kind of firing on all cylinders RtI system, you wouldn't have to ask this question. You would have that information right there with you before like even going to evaluation. But we have to consider fidelity, right? How many people, like, honest to God, collect fidelity data like as part of their MTSS RtI? Okay, couple, yeah. And I'm not trying to like call anybody out for not doing it. It's just, it gets forgotten. There's a lot of pushback against it. There's a variety of reasons why fidelity doesn't, data doesn't get collected. But if you, it's the foundation of the validity of the decision you're making, right? Is, did the child get the instruction that we said we were going to give him? And again, not pointing fingers, but what research tells us about fidelity in schools is that it's terrible. Like less than 50%. Like 50% is like, you're good if you're at 50%. Which means that half of the kids that we think are getting some type of intervention and support aren't. Which means that you could flip a coin and that child is not getting their intervention package or program, right? So if we're gonna use this system and these data to make a high stakes decision about a student, which a special education eligibility is, the first thing we have to do is make sure that they received the educational supports that we said we were gonna put in place for them. And that goes like through your, and it's not just like, was the intervention implemented as designed, the dosage, the frequency, were our progress monitoring measures implemented the way they need to be, right? Because frequency of progress monitoring can impact the decision you're making because it's going to impact how you're looking at growth, right? Were they administered properly? I know we had issues with a teacher who would like help kids. It was an assistant. She was a lovely lady. She did not like to see children struggle, right? But that's a problem when I'm interpreting that data as an indicator of the student's performance and growth, right? So, you can't do that. Are your screening data being conducted with fidelity? I know they made the decision one year to conduct screenings like as a group in the cafeteria. And there's actually research that says, hey, don't do that, because when the conditions around you deteriorate like that, it results in bad screening data. So you really have to look at the fidelity of your whole system and making sure that what is supposed to be happening is happening, because that's really the crux of the decision that you're making. And then past that, like I said before, I think it's looking at other factors, right? And not just focusing in so much on the numbers aspect of it. Is, all right, is this kid below a certain percentile? Do I have a slope or an SGP that's low enough to identify the student? And look at some of those other factors. Did he get quality intervention? Do I think that this intervention matched that student's need, right? Because if you don't have the student matched to the right intervention, that's going to explain their lack of growth right there, right? Environmental factors, all those types of things. So I guess in the end, I'm saying those actual two prongs in the federal criteria should probably be the last thing we're considering, right? And if we're doing RtI well, all those other things that I brought up should have been part of your problem solving leading up to the decision to refer that student, and so it should be taken care of. But if it's not, you can see how you're going to make some possibly erroneous decisions that are going to have a big impact on kids' lives.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. Perfect. So we'll shift gears a little bit. Dr. Thompson-Cook, given the similarities on the surface, given similarities on the surface, how can school personnel effectively navigate the process of differentiating between students' difficulties caused by the typical progression of English language acquisition and those indicating the presence of SLD? And this is something that I, as a school psychologist, prior to joining Patton, that I faced frequently with my fellow school psychologists and SLP colleagues.
So as a speech-language pathologist, of course, I'm focused on how are students understanding the language of instruction. Most of our schools are English language based. We have a few that are not. So that's why I tease that out a little bit. We have some schools that are immersion schools, and students within those programs are thriving because they're being instructed in the language of instruction on two fronts. When we're looking at students who are multilingual learners, who have culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds from that of the teacher, the data tell us that most of our teachers are white females. How does that represent our students, and how can they identify with us? As we're thinking about our multilingual learners, there is a process of, as they're entering school for the first time, for the country for the first time, they're now learning two different language structures. They're learning vocabulary, the sentence structure, and then they're having to combine that at the same time. The progress, depending on the learning profile of the student, can vary. Some of the students learn very quickly and become multilingual learners fast. They also are the students who often end up interpreting at the IEP meetings or the parent-teacher conferences, because they get lots of practice talking to adults who don't speak the language of their home. When we're teasing that out, of course, as part of a multidisciplinary team doing comprehensive evaluations, we're looking at that fast mapping skill. How quickly do they learn? What kind of instruction are they receiving? Is it are they receiving it in their primary language? Are they getting enough cues and prompts and support from translation so that they're also having things translated in a way that they'll allow them to understand the academic content while they're learning English at the same time. Learning language in a school setting that isn't speaking the language of your home can be kind of complex. So teasing that out really is a process of looking at multiple factors like we discussed before. How I alluded to one, how long have they been in school? How long have they been speaking English? Are they in that silent period where they're taking it all in and mapping the words with the items in their environment? As an assessor, when I would evaluate students who had different backgrounds, I would always have, depending on, here we have WIDA, but there's BICS and CALP. Those are assessments to determine their language dominance. That allows us to also look at, when I do my evaluation, I need to make sure that I'm taking into consideration their strongest method of understanding and speaking, while still considering the other language that may not be as dominant. To give you an example, I had a student that was a middle school student, secondary student, and I had a translator come with me to look at this student's second language. It wasn't my first. He spoke Spanish. I can speak enough to get by with a kindergartner, but not a middle schooler. So having an educational interpreter was absolutely critical for my assessment purposes. When we were looking at that, what we also found, and this is true to some of the BICS or the WISC scores that you'll see, is any items that related to home and the home environment were the ones that he was strongest in his home language. Any items that were, or vocabulary that was related to what he had been learning in English, English was his dominant vocabulary. So he was learning it, but again, it was at the same side by side, and then teasing that out, again, through a multidisciplinary evaluation is the only way you can determine whether there's a difference versus a disorder. Do you guys have anything else to add? I could keep going on and on. Like, I am super passionate about
This
making
could definitely
sure
be just
students
the topic of the
have
entire
what they
session,
need
yes.
while, learning the language.
Anything to offer from the school psychologist lens regarding the evaluation procedures for English language acquisition, evaluating students with SLDs? No? Moving on? Okay. So we'll talk about writing SLD. We know that reading and writing can be intricately intertwined. So what is the relationship between the two, and how can we approach the evaluation process for writing SLDs? Dr. Hunter, would you like to respond?
The same language processes that impact reading, right, whether it be at the very kind of narrow phonological level or more broad, like grammar syntax type things that would be more maybe associated with like a comprehension fluency type deficit, also tend to show up in writing, right? So students that struggle to decode struggle to spell, and students that have language problems that impact their ability to comprehend language typically have difficulty producing sentences that are coherent and follow the conventions of language and can communicate thoughts and ideas. So there are some similarities there. And then obviously, one of the key things that I think truly separates like a writing disability, like a dysgraphia, a true dysgraphia, from other types of learning disabilities, particularly writing disabilities as well, is, and writing disabilities are not well researched and understood, so let's just caveat right here. Dysgraphia is very much at the production, transcription level, right? These are students that have a ton of difficulty with writing production to the point where it impairs the entire writing process. So I am spending so much resources just trying to form the letters that I don't have cognitive resources to like devote to spelling, writing conventions, content, and things like that. Would you?
Yes.
Would you agree with that? Okay. So where I mean, obviously, I think we would all agree to there are a lot of challenges to implementing writing interventions in schools. But before I would even get there, I would say like there's probably a lack of overall attention to universal practices in writing that have good empirical support and are going to benefit a lot of students. I guess I still see a lot of hangover of things, particularly in early education, of stuff that I would classify as more like whole language type approaches to writing, like kid writing and writing workshop, as opposed to like explicit direct instruction in micro writing skills, which is really what early elementary needs to focus on, right? So I think anything you can do to get one measurement in place, right? We talked about how easy CBM is, and CBM writing is, the scoring is a little bit more resource intensive, but you can administer it to the entire classroom in like 3 minutes or less. So those measures are available. If you're not familiar with the Early Writing Project, that was some research done through the University of Minnesota and University of Missouri that they put together into a nice database individualization packet that has probes for screening and progress monitoring, materials for intervention, and a whole description about how to use them together. Great tool. It's the cheapest thing you'll spend money on in a school, and you'll get a ton of bang for your buck for it. But before you can really, I think, what gets measured gets taught, right? So we screen reading skills, and then we look at that data and evaluate it, so then we pay attention to our reading instruction because we're kind of monitoring that, right? And I think the same is true for writing. Some screening practices, I think, would go a long way just to drawing some attention to, first of all, how are we doing pervasively at a universal level? How are our kids doing with these skills, right? And then you can start building in some evidence-based programs there, or not programs, excuse me, I mean practices. Because I think trying to marry a writing program and a reading program in, 90 minutes, has anyone been able to figure out how to make that math work? Because to do both with fidelity, it seems like you just run out of time, right? So what are some high-impact strategies that we can get in place, and what are some really easy measurement that we can get in place? And then like starting there, and then you can work your way into interventions. But I would think for most schools, just getting like a basic MTSS foundation in writing is probably where everyone is. And again, there's not a ton of research on it, but there's enough out there to do some pretty good things. So I don't know if I really answered that question, but that's kind of what I thought of. Tim does a lot more with writing than I do. I don't know if you have.
How many of you have a kid who has an SLD only in writing and not in reading?
There is that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if you think you have a kid who has a writing disability, the kid probably also should be considered for a reading disability. They go hand in hand. And in fact, I think we have a lot of kids with SLDs in reading that probably also have SLDs in writing. It's just we never really looked at it very carefully because they were welcomed into the smorgasbord of an IEP that gives them whatever service they need, regardless of what their category is. So why, in some systems, why bother going through the effort of assessing writing skills if the kid's already deemed eligible for an IEP? Just write an IEP goal for writing, even though they have never been identified as such. So really, I think a lot of the assessment measures that you're using for reading would translate very nicely over into writing as well. Just putting a plug again for written expression CBM. It's really easy to give, and it's not as frightening as you might think to score it.
And as long as you're consistently wrong, like that, the problem is when you're inconsistent, right? Then your data's no. I kid too, and I would just add to that as well. Like there's a couple school psychs in the audience. I can't think of a good written expression measure that I think is not super inflated, right? You've given that kid that score. You can barely read what he's writing. Nothing is spelled correct, but somehow he gets like an 85, right? And that's not disability territory. So that was something that I struggled with, is looking, I was like, you're right, this writing is definitely needs help. I have no services for you, like no interventions available, and even what we had in special education was not really. So again, I just think if you can build anything at the universal level, you're ahead of the game there.
Okay, thank you. So whenever I was a school psychologist within a district, whenever we first initiated our journey for MTSS implementation, one of the best things that we did was to collaborate directly with the SLPs. And so, Dr. Thompson-Cook, how can SLPs contribute to that problem-solving process in the evaluation process for SLD, specifically in reading and writing?
Again, as like, through a multidisciplinary approach, looking at the the various aspects of specific learning disability. 80% of our students who have that diagnosis or term that indicates their need for support, 80% of those students have some sort of speech or language disorder that accompanies it. As we're looking as speech-language pathologists, our primary assessment is looking at the spoken language aspects. However, what we do know is whether it's language understanding or language expression, this can be represented verbally. It can be also represented in print. Teasing out the difference between the two is absolutely critical because there are students who have, that are in the normal range for their speech and language understanding and speaking, but they struggle with their ability to write and comprehend print. And this is where, you know, we really need to work at and tease out, is this a neurological aspects where the way that I simplify this is I always talk about when we're looking at reading in particular. You know, again, I'm very informal. I talk to people in a how would you get there sort of way. So if you were going to Disneyland, or Disney World rather, and there's I-95, that's the fastest path, but there is a roadblock and you have to go around, then there's another path that we have to consider. So with some of our students with SLD, that's the intensified instruction. That might also include assistive technologies that allow them to have access to the curriculum and the grade level vocabulary that they need to engage with same age peers, to engage in the curriculum while they're still learning the very specific skills needed for the area of difficulty that they're experiencing in school. So if we are, and reading is a passion of mine, if we are looking at reading fluency, we can still absolutely intensify instruction with that particular area while we're still providing access to grade level content and vocabulary again so that they're able to be progressing with their peers while they're still working on the areas that are needed for them to be independent readers, writers, and functionally, you know, like existing in the world in post-secondary settings.
Okay, thank you. So last but not least, we need to discuss math. So how is identifying SLD in math similar to reading and writing, and how is it different, Dr. Karuder?
Yeah, so math always, people, when we ask, you know, what interventions do you have in place, people will list a lot of behavior interventions, they will list a lot of reading interventions, maybe a writing intervention, maybe not a writing intervention. And then math, really, there hasn't been a lot out there. There are still schools in 2023 that don't have universal screening for math. So kind of going back to the beginning, you know, we need that universal screening that accurately identifies who is and who's not at risk. There's a lot of similarities. Instructional response is a really critical component of that. So we want to see whenever we are able to drill down to what's that most foundational skill deficit. In math, it's a little bit different. There's not a great general outcome measure in math like there is in reading, aka oral reading fluency, for example. In math, we look at mastery measure. So if students, it's really hierarchical in nature. So if students haven't mastered sums to 6, they haven't mastered sums to 10, they haven't mastered sums to 20, they're not going to be able to do things like sums to 20 if they haven't mastered sums to 6. So it really is about getting that solid instructional match with where the student's progression is with regard to their stage of learning. So if the data are reflecting a need that sums to 6 is where they're kind of stuck, we either give an acquisition or a fluency building intervention there, then we get them eventually to fluency and mastery on that skill, move to the next skill in that hierarchy. So looking at that instructional response is a critical component, but it is mastery measure, so that's a little bit different. Some of the other things touched upon, we do want to look at fidelity as well. Are we implementing, are the things in core happening like they should? Are we implementing class-wide intervention in math? That is an essential component. Are we implementing those necessary ingredients to make it work and get that growth? And then for those students, after we've implemented class-wide intervention for math, and we are able to start to differentiate those students who truly need some more intensive intervention, are we then providing that more intensive intervention in addition to core, and drilling down and looking at that instructional response? So there are a lot of similarities. A lot more schools in Pennsylvania do use RtI methodology to identify specific learning disability in reading than they do math. There are a handful. We hope to see some more of those, but that's one component. And then part of that comprehensive evaluation process, we do recommend still doing a broad achievement measure. If you were in sessions earlier, looking at math skills on a standardized achievement measure, looking at that level in comparison to similar peers is another important part of that. But we hope that more schools do that.
Thank you. So we have about 10 minutes left. We'll go through another couple of questions, and we'll allow the opportunity for questions from the audience. So I think the ultimate goal is for MTSS teams to have an integrated approach with both academics and behavior. So we'll take some time to focus on that. What might it look like in practice for an MTSS team to analyze both academic and behavioral data to drive decision-making at the systems level? Dr. Runge or Dr. Hunter?
I'll be real quick because we do want to get to audience questions. What that looks like in terms of looking at academic and behavioral data will depend upon the nature of the tier that you're looking at. So at tier 1, your universal screeners 3 times a year are going to be at different times, particularly at the beginning of the year for behavior, because you got to wait until like October to do your behavioral screening. So therefore, you're going to have 2 sets of meetings at the beginning of the year. Then you can have kind of a combined meeting in the middle of the year and at the end of the year. At tier 2, obviously, you're talking more about students in small groups, and so that's going to occur as needed when you're evaluating the quality or efficacy of the tier 2 intervention that you have installed. And then of course at tier 3, it's going to be individualized. The resource that I would draw your attention to, and I don't make anything off of this because I'm not one of the authors, but Dan Heisen, Ben Silberglit, Jason Peterson, who some of you might know because he literally lives like a half a mile from here, and Joe Kovaleski, some of you might know him, wrote an excellent book a couple of years ago, The Data-Driven School. It's like $25, $30 or whatever. You can find it on Amazon. Excellent resource. The reason I particularly like it, not only because it's well written, but because it has reproducibles that you can use to organize and structure your meetings, which all of us in schools love to have a form to fill out that kind of guides our conversation. And they have reproducible forms. You can also download the PDFs, and then you can make as many copies as you want. It's beautifully written, very much written for easy consumption for anybody. You don't have to have a strong background in school psychology or analyzing data, but the Data-Driven School, excellent resource, strongly recommend it.
Okay, so past integrating your structures, like your teaming and data analysis, like yes, those can be done by one team. I actually just talked about this yesterday, so you should just, all of you should just came to my session yesterday. The problem-solving process, if you were at George Batch's session, he talked about that today, presented some research about how that really drives the effectiveness of your MTSS system. And the problem-solving process looks the same for academics or behavior. So like if you're just following that process with fidelity, you should get results. And if one team of people is trained to do that really, really well, like you're efficient, you're saving time, and less time in meetings means more time doing other types of things. What I'm interested in now, and I think is the next step for integrating these tiers, is how do we actually integrate our support, okay? So if I have a reading problem and like low-level disruptive behaviors related to that, or moderate disruptive behaviors in the classroom related to that, right? The antecedent for that function behavior is the academic material in the classroom. How many of you actually address that when you're developing an intervention plan for that student, right? Okay, you are awesome. So kudos to you. I think a lot of times we have students and like, we may have combined our teaming, but we still have parallel intervention systems. So this student's gonna get a small group reading intervention, and we're gonna absolutely do nothing to modify the trigger for this behavior in the classroom, but we're gonna put them on check-in, check-out. and hope and pray that we can just reinforce them into behaving a little bit better, which I have not seen that work very well, right? So I'm really interested in, and I can't take credit for this at all, this is Kathleen Lane's work, and they're called low-intensity, high-impact strategies, and they really work well for addressing both behavior and academic problems. So the student I presented with yesterday did a case study where our antecedent interventions were all manipulation of the academic material and how it was presented, right? Our outcome measure was on-task behavior. So the student's behavior problem was disruptive behavior, off-task behavior, and we were able to positively influence that by simply just addressing how the academic material was presented to the student. The student was also getting a small group reading intervention, right? So we can't ignore the 90, 200 or whatever minutes a day that students are not in our small groups. We have to start modifying how we're presenting that material to them, right? Even at a tier 1 level, if you're looking at your ODRs and you have tons of disruptive behaviors during classroom instruction and you look at your academic data and like 50% of your kids are proficient, you can do double tickets all you want, they're probably still going to act out. You need to start implementing some explicit instruction, start looking at curricula, increasing response opportunities, like something that's going to address both this idea that I am doing something behaviorally, but the root cause of it is academics.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes left, and this is an excellent opportunity to ask questions to this wonderful panel of experts. Does anyone have any questions? I can walk down here if you could wait till we get the mic. Anyone? Nope.
Hi, this is a really quick question. Can a school say they're doing MTSS if they're not doing any universal screening? Because I'm in a big fight with my school district. It's been like a year, and they promote, we do MTSS and RtI, but they don't do universal screenings, they don't collect data on students. So I
would say they're not doing MTSS.
That's what I say.
A key component.
Is this being recorded?
It is.
Usually at the top of any list. Of
Anyone
things we need
else?
to do.
Is it on? All right, thank you. Quick question. So just actually is relating to what you just mentioned earlier. So it was perfect. It really caught my attention because I have a student who's I'm an emotional support teacher at elementary school, and I have a student who just moved in from New Jersey, and I have been not just this the beginning of the year, and I have been working a lot with our school psychologist who just started in October because she was held 60 days, and we're having a hard time figuring out what is causing, what the real issue is. He's definitely not an emotional support kid. It was one of those things. He moved in until he got his evaluation done. So getting to the question, sorry about that, I keep circling around. How do I hate using the word convince, but a lot of times I feel like I have to convince our schools higher ups, like the special ed director, or even sometimes the psychologists themselves, to say that, I'm telling you, I'm adamant about it, this is what he needs, because sometimes, fortunately, our school psych's really good and listens to all the feedback, but a lot of times I've worked with school psychs who were pretty much just shoo you away. So what's ways from the psychologist's perspective that you can discuss, the student needs more academical interventions than behavioral interventions? What's some ways to that would make the light bulb go off in their head?
Yeah. Do you have progress monitoring? I always looked at progress monitoring data. I mean, if you had progress monitoring data that suggested this student was at a level that would be commensurate with our students who need that level of support,
Right.
I'd be like, you convinced me,
Right. Because like we just have and this is something that in other districts, and big part of the reason why I'm going back to school for my special ed supervisory certificates and all that stuff is because once we place somebody, they don't really move them. Even though I can't stand that because I have a kid who I've been pushing to get into learning support, and they won't do it because he's labeled ES. But I'm showing them the data, like this kid is causing behaviors because he can't read, not because the behaviors are keeping him from reading.
I don't know if this is going to work, but this is how I usually kind of frame this. Think of your least favorite class in college.
Okay.
And imagine, like everybody, collectively, think about your least favorite. It probably was mine, with me. Stats, like advanced multivariate stats. You're weird like me. You enjoyed it, but not most people. So what was the behavior that you exhibited in your least favorite class in college? You didn't go, you slept. This is going back to when I was in college. You brought the newspaper. Do people know what a newspaper is? Like you brought the newspaper. You engage in a lot of off-task, mildly disruptive behavior. Now in college, there is no office that they send you down to. Right?
Yeah.
All of us in our least favorite class look like we might need emotional support. Do we really need emotional support? No. It's a lack of match between our needs or our motivation and the instruction that we're receiving.
Right.
And therefore, I think that's, at least for me, that's how I tend to frame it with my teacher or administrator or school psych colleagues, is all of us, when put into an environment that isn't motivating for us and is very challenging, will look a lot like someone who needs emotional support.
Right, and I feel like I have that a lot, and I get the kids who just don't fit in, but I tell them, I'm saying, I see them every day. I know what the kid needs because I've gone through I've been passed around through my time in schooling, and that's what led me to do what I'm doing today. So I appreciate you answering the question. Sorry that I keep elaborating. I could talk about this all day.
I think we all could. Thank you very much. So we are out of time. We do have one more question that we're still going to allow her to ask, but if for any of you who need to leave, I wanted to provide a reminder regarding the NASP CPD. Make sure you scan the QR code on your way out on that poster. Okay, and let's give a round of applause for our panelists. Can you all still answer one more question?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not going anywhere.
I promise I'll be brief. So my question is related to the level and trend, the dual discrepancy data decision making. So would you recommend we look at general outcome measure data as our slope, or should we be looking at mastery measurement, some combination thereof? Like, where do you kind of land on that? Because I know for intervention planning, informative decision making, I want both, but for eligibility decisions, what should we be doing?
I think so there is no general outcome measure that has the reliability standards that we need for high stakes decision making in math. So you're really looking at mastery measures there. That's the most evidence-based outcome there. In reading, I think, again, you have to look at what's our requirements for making a high stakes decision. So our instruments have to be sound technically. So I think that really pushes you towards a GOM in reading because they tend to meet those requirements. But that doesn't mean that other information, again, isn't useful and can't be part of your decision making as well. Because something I always harp on my students about, right, is the evaluation is not just about eligibility. It's also supposed to inform our intervention and instructional planning for that. So that's where your sub-skill mastery measurement and kind of is going to be very helpful to anyone who's trying to pick that up and say, okay, what do I need to do with this student? And again, it's not hard to get all that data. It's not like time consuming or other opinions.
Just add to that with regard to writing, since we really don't have high quality measures and curriculum-based measures. I mean, the evidence base is still being built. You're still going to rely on your more traditional standardized norm-referenced achievement measure, which apparently if you get it from Drew, it's going to be an inflated score.
All right. Other people were backing me up on that, right? Like, in fact, if I will just add this to be snarky back at Tim. There is no written expression composite on any standardized achievement test that I'm aware of that meets the reliability standards for high-stakes decision-making, so
Yeah.
boom.
Yeah. He's right.
But you use what's available to you.
Okay, thank you. Let's give one more round of applause. This is our panelists' contact information, and several of our panelists are sticking around for a second panel. So if you all want to stick around and have the opportunity to ask them some more questions.
I need to get some